Hello, and welcome to the Fair Housing Accessibility First training curriculum on fair housing accessibility guidelines, supplemental notice, and special topics. This training is approximately an hour and a half long. Under the GoToWebinar platform, you will find several dashboard items. This includes the viewing screen. You will see at the top, it will state whose screen you are viewing and allow you to zoom in or screenshot the items you see on the screen. The webcam function should be disabled. You can set up the dashboard to include the screen that is being shared and the GoToWebinar control panel. Or you can move it to another window if you have multiple screens. The GoToWebinar control panel is where you will control your audio, review any attached handouts, and ask any questions. Today, we have 3 handouts in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. These handouts include the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, and the Participant Workbook. During the webinar, we will be conducting knowledge checks. The GoToWebinar platform calls these quick polls. When we launch the polls, they will automatically appear. To select your answer, click the circle next to the answer and hit submit at the bottom. For attending at least 45 minutes of today's presentation, you will receive an attendance certificate. If you attend for less than 45 minutes, you will not receive an attendance certificate. The attendance certificate will be sent tomorrow. If you take the final quiz, which will be available at the end of today's presentation, and you pass the quiz, you will receive a passing certificate. The final quiz was in the reminder email and will be in the email that comes to participants 2 hours after the end of the webinar. You may take the quiz at any time following this training, and passing certificates will immediately be issued for a score of 80% or better. Today's agenda includes an introduction, topics, and learning objectives to help you understand the special topics presented in the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines Supplemental Notice. During this session, we will cover the following topics and learning objectives. Our terminal learning objective, or TLO, will help you identify Fair Housing Act compliance information provided by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and answers to questions in the Supplement to Notice of Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines. Our topics and enabling learning objectives, or ELOs, are as follows. Topic 1, Fair Housing Act Overview. ELO, identify the history and protections of the Fair Housing Act. Topic 2, Safe Harbors. ELO, understand the purpose of a safe harbor. Topic 3, the Supplemental Notice. ELO, understand the purpose of the supplement notice. Topic 4, Section 1, covered multifamily dwelling. ELO, identify guidance concerning covered multifamily dwellings in the supplemental notice. Topic 5, Section 2, guideline requirements. ELO, Identify guidance concerning the 7 FHA requirements in the supplemental notice. The next portion of the training will be the live Q&A session, followed by the knowledge check review and the close, and then you will be able to take the quiz. This training relies on the provisions of the FHA and its regulations, the accessibility guidelines, and the supplemental questions and answers, the American National Standards Institute, or also known as ANSI A117.1, 1986, and the Fair Housing Act Design Manual for the guidance that it provides about compliance with the technical design and construction requirements in the Act. Today's presenters include Mr. Eric Contreras, Mr. Joe Burns, and I'm Crystal Nolan. Mr. Contreras, our subject matter expert, has 20 years of experience performing accessibility consulting services, Americans with Disabilities Act compliance evaluation, implementation plan development, ADA corporate policy guidance and interpretation, and ADA compliance reviews. During the live Q&A session, Mr. Contreras will answer the questions you type into the questions pod. Mr. Burns has 20 years of experience in education as a teacher and instructional designer, and he has worked with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Army, and HUD. And I'm Crystal Nolan. I have worked in education, media, and advocacy for over 20 years, and I'm pleased to assist with today's training. Technical support will be provided by Ms. Corey Nolan and Ms. Alexia Brown. Ms. Liz Dyson will take your questions and organize them for the Q&A portion of today's presentation. The Fair Housing Accessibility First program provides a design and construction resource center, also known as the DCRC, which is staffed Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern. The DCRC provides comprehensive and detailed instructions, helpful online web resources, and an information line for technical guidance and support. You can reach the DCRC toll-free at 888-341-7781. Or you can reach the DCRC at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. And now let's move into our first topic, the FHA overview with some FHA history. Over 50 years ago, Congress enacted Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Known as the Fair Housing Act, or the FHA, the landmark legislation outlawed discrimination in public and private housing and prohibited housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. In 1988, Congress amended the FHA coverage to prohibit discriminatory housing practices based on familial status and disability. The FHA protects not only buyers or renters who are disabled, but also households that include a person with a disability and people who are not disabled, but are associated with people who are disabled. Covered dwellings. The legal protections of the FHA cover certain types of public and private dwelling units. Coverage applies to all dwelling units in buildings containing 4 or more dwelling units if the buildings have 1 or more elevators, and all ground floor units in buildings containing 4 or more units without an elevator. This includes, but is not limited to, apartments, condominiums, student dormitories, assisted living, nursing homes, cooperatives, and other types of housing, for example, transitional and homeless shelters that are used as a residence. First, occupancy. The FHA design and construction requirements apply to covered multifamily dwellings that are designed and constructed for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. It is important to note that a building was not designed or constructed for first occupancy if it was used for any purpose or occupied on or before March 13, 1991, or if the last building permit or renewal of a building permit was issued on or before June 15, 1990, or if rehabilitation occurs after March 13, 1991. Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines. The authority to compose the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, also called the Guidelines, was bestowed to HUD by Congress to provide technical assistance to those involved with implementing the accessibility requirements of the FHA. HUD's technical assistance was developed into 7 technical requirements for the guidelines, which establish the minimal levels of accessibility and which areas of a multifamily development would have accessibility obligations. The 7 basic requirements are: Requirement 1, accessible building entrance on an accessible route. Requirement 2, accessible and usable public and common use areas. Requirement 3, usable doors. Requirement 4, accessible routes into and through the covered unit. Requirement 5, light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls in accessible locations. Requirement 6, reinforced walls in bathrooms for later installation of grab bars. And Requirement 7, usable kitchens and bathrooms. So we're at the point where we've reached our first knowledge check. Joe, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Crystal. Our first knowledge check asked, a school built in 1971 and rehabilitated in 1992 into 25 multifamily units is blank under the FHA. Is that A, covered, or B, not covered? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to watch the poll for everyone. There we go. So now let's check 1. A school built in 1971 and rehabilitated in 1992 into 25 multifamily units is blank under the FHA. Is that A, covered, or B, not covered? Give everyone a few more seconds to put their answers in. Looks like we've got the majority of people have their answers in. So I'm going to close this poll and send it back to Crystal for the key takeaways.
Thank you, Joe. Key takeaways. The FHA prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, and disability. The legal protections of the FHA cover all dwelling units in buildings containing 4 or more dwelling units if there is an elevator, and ground floor units if there is no elevator. The guidelines only apply to covered multifamily dwellings designed and constructed for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. HUD's technical assistance was developed into 7 requirements for the guidelines. Okay, we're going to move ahead to topic 2, safe harbor. What is a safe harbor? A safe harbor is an objective and recognized standard, guideline, or code that, if followed without deviation, ensures compliance with the Act's design and construction requirements. The FHA does not establish a single accessibility standard. Architects, designers, and builders must select a standard that anchors their construction to the requirements of the FHA. Experienced builders use the guidelines and the supplemental notice for the safe harbor it provides. There are currently 15 HUD-approved safe harbors. For a list of the 15 HUD-approved safe harbors, visit the FHA Frequently Asked Questions page on HUD's website. It is vital to know that safe harbor standards constitute safe harbors only when adopted and implemented in accordance with the policy statement that HUD published in the Federal Register on March the 23rd, 2000. The selection of a safe harbor may depend upon the state and locality of a project. Once a specific safe harbor document has been selected, the building in question must comply with all the provisions that address the FHA design and construction requirements. The benefit of safe harbor status may be lost if a designer or builder chooses to select provisions from more than one safe harbor document, from various sources, or if waivers of provisions are requested and received. Using a HUD safe harbor does not change HUD's responsibility to investigate complaints. This training relies on the provisions of the Fair Housing Act and its regulations, the ANSI A117.1 1986 version, the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, and the Supplemental Notice Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, questions and answers about the guidelines, which was issued by HUD. And Joe, it's that time again. Knowledge check 2.
Thank you, Crystal. Our second knowledge check asks, the guidelines were developed to provide a safe harbor for compliance with blank. Is that A, FHA, B, CRHA 2000, or C, IBC 2018? So we launched that poll. There we go. Knowledge check 2, the guidelines were developed to provide a safe harbor for compliance with blank. Is that A, FHA, B, CRHA 2000, or C, IBC 2018? Looks like everyone got their answers in very quickly this time and did very well. So I'm going to close this poll and send it back to Crystal for the takeaways.
Fantastic. Important things to remember from topic 2. The guidelines were developed to provide a safe harbor for compliance with the FHA. A safe harbor is an objective and recognized standard, guideline, or code. The benefit of safe harbor status may be lost if provisions are selected from more than one safe harbor document, a variety of sources, or if waivers are requested and received. The use of HUD-recognized safe harbors does not change HUD's responsibility to investigate a complaint. And there are 15 HUD-approved safe harbors. Topic 3, the supplemental notice. On March 6, 1991, HUD published the final Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines. After the publication of the guidelines, HUD received many questions. As a result, the Supplement to Notice of Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, questions and answers about the guidelines was published in the Federal Register on June 28, 1994. It is included in Part 3, the appendix of the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, which was published in August 1996 and then again updated in 1998. The supplement is presented in 2 sections. The first section answers questions concerning various types of new multifamily dwellings covered by the guidelines, and the second section answers questions related to the technical specifications in the guidelines. The supplemental notice addresses frequently asked questions concerning the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 24, Chapter 1, which explains the scope of the Fair Housing Act and the technical specifications in the guidelines for multifamily dwelling units covered under the Act. With the variety in types of multifamily dwellings and dwelling units and the continual introduction of new building and interior designs, it is impossible for the department to prepare accessibility guidelines to address every housing type or design. However, the department intends to assist the public in complying with the design and construction requirements of the FHA through workshops and seminars, telephone assistance, written replies to written inquiries, and the publication of documents such as the supplemental notice. Laws that may overlap. Certain covered dwellings, certain covered dwellings and certain public and common use areas of those dwellings may be covered by other laws. These laws include, but are not limited to, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which applies to programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. The Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 applies to certain buildings financed in whole or in part with federal funds. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, also known as the ADA, applies to accessibility requirements for public accommodations, commercial facilities, state and local governments, and some residential facilities. State or local building codes apply additional standards in many jurisdictions. HUD received a number of questions regarding the applicability of the ADA to residential housing. Specifically, if the ADA covers public and common use areas of residential housing. In fact, residential facilities only used by residents and their guests are not considered places of public accommodation and are not subject to the ADA. If the residential facility is open to persons other than residents and their guests, it is covered by the ADA. And again, let me go back and repeat that. In fact, residential facilities only used by residents and their guests are not considered places of public accommodation, and they are not subject to the ADA. Now, for instance, rental offices and sales offices for residential housing are by their very nature open to the public. So they are places of public accommodation and they must comply with the ADA requirements in addition to the FHA. Joe, it's time for our third knowledge check. I'm gonna slide it over to you.
Thank you, Crystal. So our third knowledge check asked, the supplemental notice was published to address frequently raised questions about the guidelines. Is that A, true, or B, false? Let's launch that poll. Once again, knowledge check 3. The supplemental notice was published to address frequently raised questions about the guidelines. Is that A, true, or B, false? And once again, we've got a very quick group putting their answers in very quickly. Doing very well on these questions this afternoon. So with that, I'm going to close this poll and send it back to you, Crystal.
Thank you again, Joe. Key takeaways. The supplement to notice of Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines was published in the Federal Register on June 28, 1994. The supplemental notice addressed frequently raised questions about the guidelines. Certain covered dwellings and certain public and common use areas of such dwellings may be covered by other laws. And so that takes us to topic 4, section 1, covered multifamily dwelling. The first section of the supplemental notice answers questions concerning various types of multifamily dwellings covered by the guidelines. This section provides a brief preview. Please refer to this supplemental notice for additional, more detailed guidance. The supplemental notice is included at the end of the 1991 Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines PDF download, available both in this webinar and through a link, the link email that you received to attend this webinar. The first question is about townhouses, and the question is, are townhouses and non-elevator buildings that have individual exterior entrances required to be accessible? The answer is yes, if they are single-story townhouses. If they are multi-story townhouses, accessibility is not required. You can find additional discussion of townhouses in the preamble to the guidelines under section 2, definitions. The next question also deals with townhouses in a sense. Does the Fair Housing Act cover 4 one-story dwelling units that share common walls and have individual entrances? And the answer is yes. The Fair Housing Act applies to all units in buildings consisting of 4 or more dwelling units if such buildings have 1 or more elevators, and it also covers ground floor dwelling units in other buildings consisting of 4 or more dwelling units. This includes one-story homes, sometimes called single-story townhouses, villas, or patio apartments, regardless of ownership, even though such homes may not be considered multifamily dwellings under various building codes. The next question: what if the single-story dwelling units are separated by firewalls? The answer is the Fair Housing Act would still apply. The guidelines define covered multifamily dwellings to include buildings having 4 or more units within a single structure separated by firewalls. Well, at this point, we're gonna let Joe jump in again with knowledge check 4. Joe?
Thank you, Crystal. Our fourth knowledge check asked, newly constructed multi-story townhouses must be accessible whether they have elevators or not. Is that A, true, or B, false? Let's load that poll for everyone. So there you go. Now let's check 4. Newly constructed multi-story townhouses must be accessible whether they have elevators or not. Is that A, true, or B, false? And our group's doing very well today getting their answers in. Looks like we've got just about everybody's answers in. So with that, I'm going to close this poll and let Crystal take back over.
Thanks again, Joe. Now we're going to move on to talk about commercial space. The question is, if a building includes 3 residential dwelling units and 1 or more commercial spaces, is the building a covered multifamily dwelling under the Fair Housing Act? The answer is no. Covered multifamily dwellings are buildings consisting of 4 or more dwelling units if such buildings have 1 or more elevators, and ground floor dwelling units in other buildings consisting of 4 or more dwelling units. Commercial space does not meet the definition of a dwelling unit. Note, however, that Title III of the ADA applies to public accommodations and commercial facilities. Therefore, an independent determination should be made regarding the applicability of the ADA to the commercial space in such a building. Moving along to condominiums. Are condominiums covered by the Fair Housing Act? Condominiums and covered multifamily dwellings are covered by the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act makes no distinctions based on ownership. If a condominium is pre-sold as a shell and the interior is designed and constructed by the buyer, are the guidelines applicable? Yes. The FHA applies to the design and construction of covered multifamily dwellings, regardless of whether the person doing the design and construction is an architect, builder, or a private individual. Additions. If an owner adds 4 or more dwelling units to an existing building, are those units covered by the Fair Housing Act? Yes, provided that the units constitute a new addition to the building and not a substantial rehabilitation of existing units. What if new public and common use spaces are also being added? If new public and common use areas or buildings are also added, they must be accessible. If the only new construction is an addition consisting of 4 or more dwelling units, would the existing public and common use spaces have to be made accessible? The answer is no. Existing public and common use areas would not have to be made accessible. The Fair Housing Act applies to new construction of covered multifamily dwellings. Existing public and common use facilities are not newly constructed portions of covered multifamily dwellings. However, reasonable modifications to the existing public and common use areas to provide access would have to be allowed, and the Americans with Disabilities Act may apply to certain public and common use areas. An independent determination should be made regarding the applicability of the ADA. Joe, time for knowledge check 5.
Thank you, Crystal. So our fifth knowledge check asks, excuse me, when a condo is pre-sold as a shell, and the buyer designs and constructs the interior, the guidelines are not applied. Is it a true statement or a false statement? Once again, launching the poll. When a condo is pre-sold as a shell and the buyer designs and constructs the interior, the guidelines are not applied. Is it A, true, or B, false? Looks like we've got just about everyone answered already. So I'm going to close up this poll. And Crystal, back to you again.
Thank you. More than one ground floor. The question is, if a 2 or 3-story building is to be constructed on a slope such that the lowest story can be accessed on grade on one side of the building, and the second story can be accessed on grade on the other side of the building, do the dwelling units on both the first and second stories have to be made accessible? The answer, yes. By defining ground floor to be any floor of a building with an accessible entrance on an accessible route, the Fair Housing Act regulations recognize that certain buildings, based on the site and the design plan, have more than one story which can be accessed at or near grade. In such cases, if more than one story can be designed to have an accessible entrance on an accessible route, then all such stories should be designed. Each story becomes a ground floor, and the dwelling units on that story must meet the accessibility requirements of the Act. And now, topic 4, key takeaways. The first section of the supplemental notice answers questions concerning multifamily dwellings covered by the guidelines. The guidelines apply to townhouses and non-elevator buildings with individual exterior entrances if they are single story, but do not apply if they are multi-story. Condominiums and covered multifamily dwellings are covered by the Fair Housing Act. The guidelines apply to covered multifamily dwellings regardless of whether the person doing the design and construction is an architect, builder, or a private individual. Additions of 4 or more dwelling units or public and common use spaces to an existing building are covered by the FHA. If new public and common use spaces are added to a covered multifamily dwelling, those spaces must be made accessible. In a 2 or 3-story building on a slope, such that the lowest story can be accessed on grade on one side of the building, and the second story can be accessed on grade on the other side of the building. The dwelling units on both the first and second stories must be made accessible. Topic 5, Section 2, the requirements. The second section of the supplemental notice answers questions related to the 7 technical requirements and the guidelines. This section of this training offers a brief preview. For more detailed information, please refer to the supplemental notice. Requirement 1, accessible routes to garages. The question is it necessary to have an accessible path of travel from a subterranean garage to single-story covered multifamily dwellings built on top of the garage? The answer is yes. The Fair Housing Act requires that there be an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. To satisfy requirement 1 of the guidelines, there would have to be an accessible route leading to grade level entrances serving the single-story dwelling units from a public street or sidewalk or other pedestrian arrival point. The below-grade parking garage is a public and common use facility. Therefore, there must also be an accessible route from this parking area to the covered dwelling units. This may be provided either by a properly sloped ramp leading from the below grade parking to grade level, or this can be accomplished by means of an elevator from the parking garage to the dwelling unit. Question: does the route leading from inside a private attached garage to the dwelling unit have to be accessible? The answer is no. Under requirement 1 of the guidelines, there must be an accessible entrance to the dwelling unit on an accessible route. However, this route and entrance need not originate inside the garage. Most units with attached garages have a separate main entry, and this would be the entrance required to be accessible. Thus, if there were 1 or 2 steps inside the garage leading into the unit, there would be no requirement to put a ramp in place of the steps. However, the door connecting the garage and the dwelling unit would have to meet the requirements for usable doors. And that makes it possible for the resident later on to, if they would like to connect that, that doorway to and make that available for them to enter the garage, they could add a ramp or some other device. but as long as that doorway meets that requirement. And Joe, we are at knowledge check 6. Back to you.
Thank you, Crystal. So here we go. Knowledge check 6. A private garage and attached dwelling unit require both a directly connecting accessible route and a usable door. Is that statement A, true, or B, false? So let's load that poll. Once again, knowledge check 6. A private garage and attached dwelling unit require both a directly connecting accessible route and a usable door. Is that A, true, or B, false? A few more seconds for everyone to get their votes in. And it looks like we've got just about everyone in. So with that, I'm going to close this poll. And Crystal, back to you.
Thank you again, Joe. Requirement 1, site and practicality test. The question is, the site analysis test calls for a calculation of the percentage of the buildable areas having slopes of less than 10%. What is the definition of buildable areas? The answer: the buildable area is any area of the lot or site where a building can be located in compliance with applicable codes and zoning regulations. Second, ground floors. The question: what happens if a builder deliberately manipulates the grade so that a second story, which also might have been treated as a ground floor, requires steps? The answer is deliberate manipulation of the height of the finished floor level to avoid the requirements of the FHA would serve as a basis for the department to determine that there is a reasonable cause to believe that a discriminatory housing practice has occurred. Moving along, no covered dwellings. The question is, are the public and common use areas of a newly constructed development that consist entirely of buildings having 4 or more multi-story townhouses with no elevators required to be accessible? No. The Fair Housing Act applies only to new construction of covered multifamily dwellings. Multi-story townhouses, provided that they meet the definition of multi-story in the guidelines, are not covered multifamily dwellings if the building does not have an elevator. If there are no covered multifamily dwellings on a site, then the public and common use areas of the site are not required to be accessible. However, the ADA may apply to certain public and common use areas. Again, an independent determination should be made regarding the applicability of the ADA. Parking spaces and garages. The question is, how many resident parking spaces must be made accessible at the time of construction? The answer is, the guidelines provide that a minimum of 2% of the parking spaces serving covered dwelling units be made accessible and located on an accessible route to wheelchair users. Also, if a resident requests an accessible space, additional accessible parking spaces would be necessary if the 2% are already reserved. The next question, if both open and covered parking spaces are provided, how many of each type must be accessible? The answer, the guidelines require that accessible parking be provided for residents with disabilities on the same terms and with the full range of choices. For example, surface or garage parking, the same choices that are provided for other residents of the project. Thus, if a project provides different types of parking, such as surface parking, garage, or covered spaces, some of each type must be made accessible. While the total parking spaces required to be accessible is only 2%, at least one space for each type of parking should be made accessible, even if this number exceeds that 2%. Joe, time for knowledge check 7. I'm going to send it over to you again.
Thank you, Crystal. So our knowledge check 7 asks, according to the guidelines, how many resident parking spaces must be made accessible at the time of construction? Is it A, at least 1%, B, at least 2%, C, at least 5%, or D, at least 10%? So I'm going to launch that poll for everyone. There we go. Now check 7. According to the guidelines, how many resident parking spaces must be made accessible at the time of construction? Is it A, at least 1%, B, at least 2%, C, at least 5%, or D, at least 10%? And once again, everybody's getting their answers in very quickly today, and they're doing very, very well. So with that, I'm going to close this one out already because it looks like we've got pretty much everybody's answers. And Crystal, it's back to you.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to talk about requirement 3, required width. The question is, will a standard hung 32-inch door provide sufficient clear width to meet the requirements of the Fair Housing Act? The answer, no. A 32-inch door would not provide a sufficient clear opening. A 34-inch door hung in the standard manner provides an acceptable nominal 32-inch clear opening. The next question, is it correct that only the exterior side of the main entry door of covered multifamily dwellings must meet the ANSI requirements? Yes, the exterior side of the main entry door is part of the public and common use areas and therefore must meet ANSI A1171, the 1986 version specifications for doors. These specifications include necessary maneuvering clearances and accessible door hardware. The interior of the main entry door is part of the dwelling unit and only needs to meet the requirements for usable doors within the dwelling intended for user passage. For example, having that 32-inch nominal clear width, but there are no requirements for maneuvering clearances, and hardware on usable doors. Requirement 4, sliding door. Question: if a sliding door track has a threshold of 3/4 inch, does this trigger requirements for ramps? Answer: no. The guidelines requirement 4 provides that thresholds at doors, including sliding door tracks, may be no higher than 3/4 of an inch and must be beveled with a slope no greater than 1 to 2. And with that, Joe, I'm going to send it back to you for our 8th knowledge check.
Yep, here we go. Knowledge check 8. Which Fair Housing Act requirement addresses the thresholds at doors, including the sliding door tracks? The A, requirement 1, B, requirement 2, C, requirement 3, or D, requirement 4. I'm going to launch that poll. Once again, which Fair Housing Act requirement addresses the thresholds at doors, including sliding door tracks? Is it A, requirement 1, B, requirement 2, C, requirement 3, or D, requirement 4? And everyone's doing a great job getting their answers in. Looks like we've got almost everyone just about ready. And with that, I'm going to close this poll. And Crystal, back to you.
Thank you. So we're still talking about requirement 4, but now we're talking about split level entry. And the question is a dwelling unit that has a split entry foyer with the foyer and living room on an accessible route and the remainder of the unit down 2 steps required to be accessible if it is a ground floor unit in a covered multifamily dwelling? Yes. Under requirement 4, there must be an accessible route into and through the dwelling unit. This would preclude a split level foyer unless a properly sloped ramp can be provided. Moving along to requirement 5, range hood fans. Question: must the switches on range hood kitchen ventilation fans be in an accessible location? No. Kitchen ventilation fans located on a range hood are considered to be part of the appliance. The FHA has no requirements for appliances in the interior of dwelling units or the switches that operate them. Though not a requirement, it is important to note that many appliance companies sell range hoods that can be incorporated into a kitchen to provide access for a seated user. Range hoods can be operated from a wall switch within reach of the user that does not require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting. Requirement 6, type of reinforcement. Question: what type of reinforcement should be used to reinforce bathroom walls for the later installation of grab bars? The answer is the guidelines do not prescribe the type of material to use or the method of providing reinforcement for bathroom walls. The guidelines recognize that grab bar reinforcing may be accomplished in various ways, such as installing plywood or vertical reinforcement in the form of double studs at the points noted in the figure in the guidelines related to reinforcement. Builders and owners should maintain records that reflect the placement of the reinforcing material so that it can be later referenced by a resident who wishes to install a grab bar. Types of grab bar. The question is, what types of grab bars should the reinforcement be designed to accommodate, and what types may be used if the builder elects to install grab bars in some units at the time of construction? The answer: the guidelines do not prescribe the type of product for grab bars or the structural strength for grab bars. The guidelines only state that the necessary reinforcement must be placed so as to permit later installation of appropriate grab bars. In determining what is an appropriate grab bar, builders are encouraged to look to the 1986 ANSI A117.1 standard, the standard cited by the Fair Housing Act. Builders also may follow state or local standards in planning for or selecting the appropriate grab bars. Requirement 7, counters and vanities. The question is, it appears from figure C of the guidelines under requirement 5 that there is a 34-inch height requirement for kitchen counters and vanities. Is this true? No. Requirement 7 addresses the requirement for usable kitchens and bathrooms so that a person in a wheelchair can maneuver about the space. The legislative history of the Fair Housing Act makes it clear that Congress intended that the act affect ability to maneuver within the space of the kitchen and the bathroom, but not to require fixtures, cabinetry, or plumbing of adjustable design. Figure 2C of the guidelines is illustrating the maximum side reach over an obstruction. Because the picture was taken directly from the ANSI A117.1 1986 standard, the diagram also shows the height of the obstruction, which in this picture is a countertop. This 34-inch height, however, should not be regarded as a requirement. Joe, back to you for Knowledge Check 9.
Yep. All right. Thank you. So Knowledge Check 9, the guidelines do not explicitly require kitchen counters and vanities to be 34 inches in height. Is that A, true, or B, false? So there we go. Knowledge Check 9, there we just launched the poll. The guidelines do not explicitly require kitchen counters and vanities to be 34 inches in height. Is that A, true, or B, false? Once again, we've got everyone answering pretty quickly. A few more seconds here. Looks like just about everyone's got their answers in. So I'm going to close this poll. And Crystal, on to you for showers.
Thank you. Question: is a parallel approach required at the shower as shown in figure 7D of the guidelines? The answer is yes. For a 36 by 36 inch shower, as shown in figure 7D, a person in a wheelchair would typically add a wall-hung seat. Thus, the parallel approach, as shown in the figure, is essential in order to be able to transfer from the wheelchair to the shower seat. And back to you, Joe, for knowledge check 10.
Thank you, Crystal. Our final knowledge check 10, asks, a 36-inch by 36-inch shower requires a blank approach. The A, diagonal, B, negotiated, C, parallel, or D, direct. So let's launch that poll. Once again, a 36-inch by 36-inch shower requires a blank approach. The A, diagonal, B, negotiated, C, parallel, or D, direct. Just a few more seconds. Everybody's getting their answers in very quickly today. And I think that's just about it. So I'm going to close this poll. And Crystal, back to you.
Fantastic. Requirement 7, lavatory. The question: would it be acceptable to use removable base cabinets beneath a wall-hung lavatory where a parallel approach is not possible? Yes. The space under and around the cabinet should be finished prior to installation. For example, the tile or other floor finish must extend under the removable base cabinet. Wing walls. The question: can a water closet, known as a toilet, be located in an alcove with a wing wall? Yes, as long as the necessary clear floor space shown in figure 7A is provided. This would mean that the wing wall could not extend beyond the front edge of a lavatory located on the other side of the wall from the toilet, or the water closet, as it's sometimes called. Topic 5, key takeaways. The second section of the supplemental notice answers questions related to the 7 technical requirements in the guidelines. It is necessary to have an accessible route from a subterranean garage to a single-story covered multifamily dwelling or dwellings that are built on top of the garage. A private garage does not have to be on an accessible route directly into the dwelling unit it is attached to, but the door connecting the garage and dwelling unit must still meet the requirement for usable doors. Buildable area is any area of the lot or site where a building can be located in compliance with applicable codes and zoning regulations. If a builder deliberately manipulates a site or lot grade, so a second story that might have been treated as a ground floor requires steps, HUD may determine that there is reasonable cause to believe that a discriminatory housing practice has occurred. The guidelines do not apply to buildings with less than 4 dwelling units, even if the building also contains 1 or more commercial spaces. The guidelines provide that a minimum of 2% of resident parking spaces must be made accessible at the time of construction. The guidelines require that accessible parking be provided for residents with disabilities on the same terms and with the full range of choices provided for other residents of the project. A 34-inch door provides an acceptable nominal 32-inch clear opening. Only the exterior side of the main entry door of covered multifamily dwellings must meet ANSI requirements. Fair Housing Act Requirement 4 addresses the requirements for thresholds at doors, including sliding track doors, or sliding door tracks, I should say. A split level foyer is prohibited unless a properly sloped ramp is provided. The FHA has no requirements for appliances or the switches that operate them. The guidelines do not prescribe the type of material to use or method of reinforcing bathroom walls. The guidelines do not prescribe the type of product or structural strength for grab bars. The guidelines do not explicitly require kitchen counters and vanities to be 34 inches in height. A 36-inch by 36-inch shower requires a parallel approach. It is acceptable to use removable base cabinets beneath a wall-hung lavatory where a parallel approach is not possible. So now we have reached our live Q&A session. Let's see what questions have come in during today's training. So we have a question, Eric. The question is, for requirement 7, counters and vanities are not explicitly required to be 34 inches high, but if the maximum reach range is 24 inches, wouldn't then the counter need to be a maximum of 34 inches to allow that? Also, the image doesn't appear to depict a countertop. Is the 24 inches to the front of the cabinet or countertop, which typically extends an additional 1 to 1.5 inches?
Thank you. Thank you for that, Crystal. So the Fair Housing Act requirement does not impose any height requirement for counters and vanities. The Fair Housing Act does require that switches, outlets, and environmental controls be mounted within accessible reach ranges, but allows the countertop to be mounted exceeding ANSI heights for obstructions, as indicated in the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, page 5.8. And in addition to that, HUD does allow that 1.5 inch extension for the countertop to a 25.5 inch extension.
Thank you for that answer, Eric. The next question: if the trash chute has specific instructions on use, must this be in Braille as well?
So informational signage is not required to be in Braille.
Thank you for that answer. Let's see, our next question. What does that mean? Safe harbors may be subject to locality. Don't all 15 safe harbors work in all localities?
So I think that is a misunderstanding of what was stated in the presentation. The presentation stated that the selection of a safe harbor may depend upon the state and the location of the project. So designers and builders may choose one of the 15 safe harbors, which apply regardless of the location of the project, but a designer may choose a safe harbor, for example, IBC 2018, that has been adopted by a local municipality and therefore comply not only with the state or local building department requirement, but also with the Fair Housing Act safe harbor requirement. If, on the contrary, a designer chooses a safe harbor that is not adopted by the building department, the designer will have to comply with both the local requirements and the Fair Housing Act safe harbor that is chosen.
Thank you for that answer, Eric. The next question is, since a direct accessible route from inside an attached private garage to the dwelling unit interior is not required, is an accessible route required from the garage to the dwelling unit's front door?
The Fair Housing Act requires an accessible route from the primary entrance of the covered dwelling unit to the site amenities and accessible features. The accessible route is required from the garage to the primary entry of the covered dwelling unit.
Thanks again. The next question. When will the FHA deal with requirements for electric charge care and vans?
The Fair Housing Accessibility First program is not involved in rulemaking or adoption of new materials, and we cannot speak on this. However, if you are considering electrical charge stations for vehicles, these should be located in a common use area, and as such, they are required to be accessible. The electric vehicle charging station should be located on an accessible route. It should have a 30-inch by 48-inch clear floor space, and it should be mounted within accessible reach ranges for operable parts between 15 inches to 48 inches above the finished floor.
Thank you again for that answer. The next question. What is the maximum depth of hall closets and kitchen pantry closets with doors that provide a clear width less than 32 inches?
So closets are generally 24 inches deep, but vary in dimensions. It is fair to anticipate that persons with disabilities should have access to the same amenities, and therefore the door opening should provide a 32-inch nominal opening if the closet will be deeper than 24 inches, and it is anticipated that the resident will have to go into the pantry. That being said, the 24-inch depth is a good rule of thumb for a maximum depth that does not require user passage, but it is not a hard set requirement.
Okay. Next question. Does the clear floor space at the shower need to be directly adjacent to the curb of the shower, or can it have a slight offset to allow for the installation of a flange of the shower surround?
The shower requires that the 30-inch by 48-inch clear floor space be parallel and flush with the control wall. So if this is a construction material and maybe there's a slight offset for it, that should still be fine.
Okay. Let's see, I think we have time for a few more questions. And let's see. We have a question. If the door opposing the toilet is a closet door and is the only door to the closet, must the 66-inch clear depth still be provided, or may the more common 56-inch depth be provided?
So to answer the question, this will depend on the approach to the toilet. If they are mentioning that the door that comes from the closet is the door to enter the restroom, and it is a forward approach to the toilet, then this is a front approach and a 48-inch by 66-inch clear floor space is required. Now, if the approach is a parallel approach to the toilet, then a 48-inch by 56-inch clear floor space is required.
Next question. Thank you for that answer. The next question, I need some clarification on toilet flange tolerances. All FHA requirements refer to ICC A117.1 2009. We have had FHA agents tell us it has to be exactly 18 inches, but that's not accurate as to ICC A117.1 2009.
The Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, section 100.205C3IV, requires that in locations where toilets are adjacent to walls or bathtubs, the center line of the fixture is a minimum of 18 inches from the obstacle. The Fair Housing Act Guidelines diagrams 7A indicate that where the toilet is next to a wall or fixture, it must be centered 18 inches from the wall. In addition, the Fair Housing Act Design Manual also stipulates that the 18 inches from the center line of the toilet to the wall is an absolute dimension to accommodate a grab bar in the shoulders of a person seated on the toilet. So when designing, you must choose a safe harbor, and it is necessary to follow it in its entirety, as ANSI A117.1 2009 allows installing the toilet between 16 inches to 18 inches.
And I believe we have time for maybe 2 more questions. The next question is, what is the maximum opening force for a trash chutes panel door? Will the hardware have to meet the requirements of 4.13.9 of ANSI A117.1 1986?
The trash chute is located in a public use and common use space that is subject to the Fair Housing Act requirement 2. As such, it should be accessible. The trash chute's panel door is required to comply with the requirements of the safe harbor, such as ANSI A117.1 section 4.25, controls and operating mechanisms, that requires that operable parts be operable with one hand and shall not require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist, and the force required to activate operable parts shall be 5 pounds.
Okay. Is it necessary for there to be an elevator to the upper levels of structured parking garages? All housing units are also accessed via an elevator and are subject to the Act.
If the building was built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991, and it has an elevator, it is considered an elevator building. All units are covered by the Act, and 2% of the parking serving the covered dwelling units must be accessible. These potentially could be located on the first floor, but if they are dispersed, this may necessitate the installation of an elevator, depending on the number of accessible parking spaces required. Additionally, it would be necessary to check with state and local building codes as they may require an elevator serving all levels of the parking garage.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And we'll take another question. Building code requires that all new construction meets accessibility even when added to existing projects, correct?
So local building codes may differ from the Fair Housing Act, and they also may be requiring compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Fair Housing Act does not apply to buildings built before March 13, 1991. Renovations of existing buildings are not covered by the Fair Housing Act. Only additions of 4 or more units and additions of new common use areas of covered buildings are required to comply with the Fair Housing Act. You can also find additional information on the frequently asked questions numbers 8 and 33.
All right. And Eric, we have one last question. Do you think we have time?
Sure.
All right. If common areas intended for use of residents only, but the regular use in practice allows commercial tenants to use the common spaces of the building, how can compliance be enforced? Or does the ADA apply by proxy of how the building is used?
It is important to differentiate that areas that are intended for residents and their guests are covered by the Fair Housing Act. Areas of a residential building that are places of public accommodation, such as the leasing office or commercial space available for rent out to the public, are also subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act and must comply with the most stringent standards. The ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, is not a HUD-approved safe harbor. So if the area is a place of public accommodation that is open to the public, then the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act must both apply.
Eric, thank you so much for your answers to, and the attendees, thanks for such very interesting and probing questions. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Joe for our knowledge check review. Joe?
Thank you, Crystal. So let's go through our knowledge check so we can do well, everyone can get credit for their quiz. So knowledge check 1, a school built in 1971 and rehabilitated in 1992 into 25 multifamily units is blank under the FHA. That would be not covered. So that would be not covered. Knowledge check 2, the guidelines were developed to provide a safe harbor for compliance with, and that would be the first choice, FHA. So the guidelines were developed to provide a safe harbor for compliance with FHA. Knowledge check 3, the supplemental notice was published to address frequently raised questions about the guidelines, and that is true. The notice was published to address those questions. Knowledge check 4, newly constructed multi-story townhouses must be accessible whether they have elevators or not. That is actually false. So newly constructed multi-story townhouses do not have to be accessible whether they have elevators or not. So that is a false statement. Knowledge check 5, when a condo is pre-sold as a shell and the buyer designs and constructs the interior, the guidelines are not applied, and that is false. So that is a false statement. When a condo is pre-sold as a shell and the buyer designs and constructs the interior, the guidelines are not applied. That is a false statement. Number 6, a private garage attached dwelling unit require both directly connecting accessible route and a usable door. That is false. That is false. So a private garage and attached dwelling unit require both directly connecting accessible route and usable doors. That is false. Excuse me. Number 7, according to the guidelines, how many resident parking spaces must be made accessible at the time of construction? That is choice 2, at least 2%. So at least 2% must be accessible parking spaces. Number 8, which Fair Housing Act requirement addresses the threshold of doors, including the sliding door tracks? That is requirement 4. So requirement 4 is the one that addresses the threshold of doors, including those sliding door tracks. Now let's check 9. The guidelines do not explicitly require kitchen counters and vanities to be 34 inches in height. That is true. The guidelines do not cover that explicitly. And number 10, a 36-inch by 36-inch shower requires a blank approach. That is a parallel approach. So that 36-inch by 36-inch shower requires a parallel approach. And with that, I'm going to pass up to Crystal and about certificates and wrapping things up.
Thank you, Joe. For attending at least 45 minutes of today's presentation, you will receive an attendance certificate. If you attended for less than 45 minutes, you will not receive an attendance certificate. The attendance certificate will be sent tomorrow. If you do not receive the attendance certificate by Thursday morning, please check your junk or spam email and email us at fairhousingfirst.hud.gov. Let me repeat that. Please email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. If you take the final quiz and pass, you will receive a passing certificate. The final quiz will be in the email that comes to participants 2 hours after the end of the webinar. Quizzes may be taken anytime following this training event, and the certificates of passing are automatically issued when a passing score of 80 or more is achieved. If you do not receive your passing quiz certificate by Friday evening, please check your junk or spam email, and if it's not there, please email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. At the end of this training, there is a training event survey for you to complete. We appreciate your responses and support in improving our training product. Please contact us with further questions via the DCRC by calling 888-341-7781. And that number is accessible by voice or teletypewriter, or email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. You can also scan the QR code on the screen to add the DCRC's contact information to your cell phone contact. We would like to thank Joe, our presenter, Eric, our subject matter expert, the technical support crew, Corey, Alexa, and Liz, and our ASL interpreters, Jill and Deborah, and of course you, the attendees. Please join us for our next training session on Tuesday, March the 26th on the FHA and other disability rights laws and resources. And again, thank you and have a wonderful day. We will leave the information on the screen available for the next 20 seconds so that you can screenshot the information and or scan the QR code. And again, we hope you have a wonderful day.